So good evening. We're so glad that you've all joined us for this fourth session out of 4 on Era 1 in Stories of God, Stories of Race, and Stories of St. Mark's. Excuse me, Stories of St. Mark's. Lisa, would you go to the next slide, please? Mm-hmm. So we just want to review with you exactly what we are about here. So we've been tasked with researching both the history of racial justice and injustice in our congregation and in our environs. And we've broken our work into 3 different eras here. We're currently finishing up Era 1 from 1760 to 1880, which is going to bring us today through the Civil War. And with that, I think Lisa would like to review where we've been so far, all the ground we've covered. Lisa?
So I want to start with a summary of each of the 3 previous sessions leading up to this one. So in session 1, we learned the earliest moments in the life of St. Mark's Parish dated to May 1764, when the Church of England meeting house was built on West Road. We discovered that slave owners were involved in the donation of the land for the meeting house and the simultaneous sale of an adjacent 2 acres. And on that land was built a colonial house at 16 West Road in the same year, 1764, that the meeting house was built. And this was the home to the enslaved Candace and Onesimus until he turned age 9. Father Justin then taught us about the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel and the part they played in creating skin color-based enslavement. The SPG used slave labor, African slave labor on 2 sugar plantations they were bequeathed in Barbados. Proceeds from these plantations funded their work in the colonies that became the United States. So we learned about the annihilation of the regional indigenous tribes by Dutch and English mercenaries, particularly Captain John Underhill. The Sawanoi were the most prevalent indigenous peoples in this area. The Pound Ridge Massacre took place close to where we live and worship today. In session 2, we focused more on slavery in Connecticut and Canaan Parish / New Canaan. We reviewed a map depicting the economic engine of slavery along the eastern seaboard. Connecticut could survive without slavery, but the South could not. We had a glimpse into what it meant to be a slave. And then we reviewed the best numerical estimates of enslaved individuals and slave owners in Canaan Parish and New Canaan through 1880. We met our parish's first free family of color, the Smith family, who lived in a cabin on Poorhouse Road, which is also Laurel Road, once they were freed. Their slave owner had been Diana Richards, and all these individuals are buried in the Canoe Hill Cemetery. The Smith family is buried in what appears to be a segregated section of Canoe Hill Cemetery. And then finally, in session 2, we listened to a rare account of Venture Smith that provided insight into his life in Africa as an enslaved person in Rhode Island and Connecticut, and his trials to establish himself as a businessman and as a free man of color in Bias, Connecticut. So last week, we watched the video about St. Mark's first senior warden, Captain Stephen Betts, and the possibly enslaved, because we were uncertain there based on the documentation that's available, and then for sure, a free man of color, Jesse Betts. We talked about Jesse Betts in the context of slavery in Connecticut, and then we revealed members of the local clergy who were listed as slave owners in 1790. We learned that Fairfield County had Tory leanings during the American Revolution, with 1/4 of the male population sympathetic to the crown. We discussed Anglican Reverend Dibble from Stanford and his Tory activist son, Fryler Dibble. We realized that much of the funding to create Yale University came from slave owners. We learned about the enslaved Onesimus Comstock, who's buried in the Canoe Hill Cemetery. And then we saw the aftermath of the burning of Norwalk in the American Revolution. Reverend Leeming left with the Loyalist governor of New York, General Tryon, resulting in Reverend Dibble having both Stanford and Norwalk Anglican churches in his care. The burning of Norwalk resulted in the end of Anglican loyalties and the birth of the Protestant Episcopal Church. And so just a reminder to please watch for this symbol to fall into place, interlocking puzzle pieces. These are the moments when our racial history task force has drawn an important conclusion that we wish to share with you. So I just want to make a little brief point about the interconnectedness of the past with the present. And sometimes we can look at all this information and think that it's all far into the past. But I want to give you an example of where the past and the present kind of come together. A friend of mine is named Janet Carl. And there's actually two Janet Carls. There may be even more Janet Carls, but I know of two, and they were all part of the Carl family associated with the car dealership in town. There's many of them, and most of them live in New Canaan. So senior Janet Carl, the younger Janet Carl, for a general description, is kind of about my age. There's the senior Janet Carl, wife of Dick Carl. So she wants you to know, because I asked her if I could tell you all this, that her father was born at 8 Ferris Hill Road. So that was the brown shingle style home on the corner of Ferris Hill Road and Canoe Hill, where the enslaved Onesimus lived until he passed away. He was enslaved, and then he was a voluntary slave for the rest of his life. And so Janet Carl's father was born in that same house. He was born there in 1899. So 75 years separate Onesimus from Janet Carl's father living in the exact same home. Janet's mother, Bessie Belden, also lived there and is buried in the Canoe Hill Cemetery along with 4 or 5 other Belden family members that are all distant relatives of the current day Janet Carl. So that's just a way to kind of link, people together across, many years. So Father Justin and I have been working on this enslavement timeline that we promised you last week. I want to start at the top left corner, which is the seal of the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel in Foreign Parts. And this was created in London in 1706. And the caption beneath it reads, "An Anglican minister holding an open Bible is greeted by Native Americans exclaiming, 'Come over and help us,' in Latin." And this symbol is from the John Carter Brown Library at Brown University. So starting back with that yellow section on the left, and we're calling it Old Testament. This is courtesy of Dr. Allison Krusecki, who spoke at our first plenary session before Easter. And what she said was that there were in that time warring armies, battles, and conflicts. Out of those conflicts would come a definite winner and loser. Soldiers from the losing army might end up being enslaved by their conquerors, but their enslavement was not based on the color of their skin. It was based on who lost that battle or war. Enslavement was not based on skin color. So then in the late 14 and 15, and then into the 1500s, the very first enslaved individuals in the Northern Hemisphere were of indigenous origins. Conquerors, including Columbus, routinely enslaved the indigenous people they encountered. In the 1600s, in this region, and by this region, I mean where New Canaan stands today, up into where Pound Ridge is, over into Westchester County, and even onto Long Island. That's the region I'm referring to. The Dutch and the English colluded to exterminate the indigenous people in order to take their land. The overall goal was not enslavement. The goal was genocide perpetrated by hired mercenaries like Captain John Underhill. Enslavement of Africans brought from Africa began in Connecticut in the mid-1600s. So enslavement of Africans who were kidnapped and shipped to Connecticut began before the SPG arrived. The paradigm of skin color-based enslavement was being formed. In the 1700s, the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel in Foreign Parts, or SPG, was founded in 1701. In the colonies that became the United States, the focus at first was on the conversion of unchurched Protestants, Quakers, and indigenous people. The Iroquois nation was a particular focus for them. Elias New began his mission focusing on enslaved Black children in New York, the colony of New York. In 1710, the SPG was bequeathed 2 sugar plantations in Barbados, harvested by hundreds of enslaved Africans, men and women. African enslavement was justified by their being non-Christians. Physical differences such as skin color were used to differentiate, and the word white replaced the word Christian. So I'm not going to go into detail on the 1800s because we are going to present that in this session tonight. And please look to eras 2 and 3 in the fall of 2021, where the 1900s, the 20th century, and the information listed there will be presented. Father Justin, can you please tell us more about the part that the SPG played?
Thanks, Lisa. So before I speak to the points that are on this slide, which Lisa's already made reference to in the timeline, I want to give you just a little bit of background information about the SPG's involvement, and particularly a local story for us. So in 1706, a New York merchant named Elias Noe, and Noe was eventually a vestry member at Trinity Wall Street, for instance. Noe began to preach to indigenous and enslaved Black children in the colony of New York using books. Noe was a Presbyterian at the time. He was a French Huguenot, but he was recruited by the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel to become a lay catechist to the Iroquois in particular. From his writings, we understand that he thought that his catechumens were coming more for the books than for his preaching, which again speaks to the value of literacy in this period, as we've discussed in previous sessions. Noe focused more and more on the enslaved Black children to whom he was ministering, translating the Lord's Prayer into 2 African languages and into 1 indigenous language. He saw that the number of enslaved Africans greatly outnumbered the number of indigenous people in his circles, and that no missions to date had been focused on enslaved African people in particular. So there were several reasons for this. One was that slave owners feared that this teaching of the enslaved, like Noe was about, would mean that they must free their slaves. As Noe wrote in a letter from this period, quote, "Several believe that if the Negroes were baptized, they could no longer be kept as slaves after they are admitted into the Christian church. As a result, baptism would ruin the plantations that subsist only by the labor of these slaves." Noe responded to this quandary, this hiccup in his efforts to evangelize, by seeking to reform laws to ensure the legality of owning Christian slaves, slaves who were Christians. This approach was meant to accommodate and appease slave owners. Noe worked towards the creation of a 1706 New York colonial law entitled An Act to Encourage the Baptizing of Negro, Indian, and Mulatto Slaves, the first clause of which reads, is an effort to counter the, quote, "groundless opinion that had spread itself in this colony that by the baptizing of such Negro, Indian, or mulatto slaves, they would become free and ought to be set at liberty." The full text of that 1706 Act demonstrates the close connection here between the concepts of Christian slavery and its development and the consolidation of slavery on a racial basis. And just recall, all of this was to the economic benefit of the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel, recalling that in 1710, those 2 sugar plantations were willed to the SPG on the island of Barbados, and that these plantations enslaved or utilized the labor, expropriated the labor of hundreds of enslaved men and women of color on their property, men and women of African descent, and that the SPG relied on the revenue from these plantations to bankroll their missionary work in all of the colonies, including in Connecticut. This is an important part of how this concept of race-based slavery begins in the colonial period. So now turning to this slide, the broad strokes of it are this. As African people were enslaved, as Lisa explained, their enslavement was justified largely on the basis of their being non-Christians, because Christians were thought to be unable to be enslaved, something incompatible with the freedom and dignity conferred in baptism, with the status of being enslaved. Increasingly, though, English Christians identified physical differences such as skin color with the idea that these people having such physical differences, were constitutionally incapable of ever becoming Christian, which justified their enslavement in perpetuity, right? They were never to be freed because of these physical differences, and somehow because they were constitutionally incapable of becoming Christian as a result of them. Something like hereditary heathenism is what the scholar Rebecca Getz calls this idea. But as missionaries began to prioritize evangelizing the native and African populations, they assured the slave owners that their efforts did not overturn the status quo by expediently arguing that you could become a Christian and continue to be enslaved, that these two things were compatible with one another. And of course, the missionaries, as I just said, were supported by sugar crops grown and harvested by slave labor in Barbados. Then, since both Christians and non-Christians alike could be enslaved, race began to suffice as justification for the perpetual enslavement of African people, rather than there being non-Christians. The real, the proverbial puzzle piece here is that early English documents contrast the terms Christian and Negro, but by the 1680s, white had begun to replace the word Christian across these discourses. This is not to say that Anglicans and Anglican missionaries in particular were wholly or completely responsible for race-based slavery, but it is to say that Anglican religious belief and practice played an important role in the emergence of race as a justification for the perpetual enslavement of Black people in the 17th and 18th centuries. And that this is a larger cultural and political shift in which many of our local clergy were involved. Back to you, Lisa.
Thank you, Father Justin. So now we want to turn to soldiers of color from Norwalk and Stamford in the American Revolution. According to the research website Liberty Fund, there were 5 soldiers of color from Norwalk and 4 from Stamford during the American Revolution. If there were soldiers of color from Canaan Parish, they would be included in these numbers. The book, Connecticut's Black Soldiers, 1775 through 1783, by David O. White, lists several by name. Samuel Bush from Stamford, who received a pension for his service during the war. Cassor, Negro from Stamford. Ned, Negro from Norwalk. John Rogers from Norwalk, and Solomon Sustis from Wilton and Norwalk. Soldiers of color served in the 1st through 9th Connecticut regiments and in many other units, including the Continental Army. A total of 820 African-American soldiers and seamen served in the American Revolution from Connecticut, 820. Connecticut's Black Company was the 2nd company of the 4th Regiment, formed in 1781. The head of this unit was Colonel David Humphreys, but at the time he also served as aide-de-camp to General Washington, so his attention to and influence on the company was next to nothing. The company was active from 1781 to 1783. All of the officers and non-commissioned officers were white, and all of the privates were Black. Most companies had about 35 men, but this company had 48 men. The company was treated on equal footing with other companies in that they received the same amount of provisions and same pay as per soldier. So we checked the roster from the 2nd Company, 4th Regiment, and found Black soldiers from Bridgefield, Milford, and many other Connecticut towns, but none from Stamford or Norwalk. Connecticut laws at first restricted participation by Black soldiers in the war. A law enacted in the fall of 1775 limited African-American participation, and then another law rejected their participation entirely. By winter of 1775, the law was changed again. Free Blacks could now enlist, but Black slaves were prohibited. In December 1776, every town was required to form a reserve militia to include ministers, Yale teachers and students, enslaved men of color, indigenous men, and mulattoes. By May of 1777, Connecticut faced a shortage in meeting its quota for an army. A specially appointed legislative committee was formed that recommended that slaves be allowed to enlist, but Connecticut residents rejected the idea. Residents were allowed to hire African Americans as substitutes, though, and by October of that year, the position was established that enslaved soldiers were to be freed after their service. The subtext was that Black soldiers were good fighters and they wanted to be there. As the war went on, Connecticut desperately needed their participation. And so over time, the laws were changed so that Black soldiers could stay and fight. In fact, at Washington's headquarters in White Plains in August of 1778, there were 755 African American soldiers, of which 210 were from Connecticut. Parsons Regiment, in Connecticut Regiment, had 148 African Americans, the largest of any regiment at White Plains. At least 90 African American soldiers from Connecticut applied for pensions after the war, including Bristol Bud from our video last week. This was the most integrated the American military would be up until the Korean War. Several soldiers of color received bounty land for military service in the fire lands of Ohio, including the previously enslaved Syphax from Norwalk, Ned from Fairfield, and Roger from Danbury. The firelands were part of Connecticut's Western Reserve, abutting Lake Erie. Many townspeople from Norwalk, Danbury, and Fairfield were also gifted lands, but they're in payment for their losses during the burning of Norwalk, Fairfield, and the Danbury raid. Huron County, Ohio has town names of Norwalk, Greenwich, and New London still today. Indigenous soldiers in the Revolutionary War. In 1774, a population of only 600 indigenous men was recorded in Connecticut. Most of the indigenous men from Connecticut who fought on the side of the Americans during the Revolution were Mohegans, but there were soldiers from other tribes as well. One Mohegan tribe widow listed in Ledyard town records lost 4 sons in the American Revolution, 4. From the DAR Forgotten Patriots series, this quote, "The Revolutionary War had a profound impact on both the African American and indigenous populations of Connecticut. It saw the beginning of the end of slavery for Black soldiers, while the already small indigenous population suffered a high casualty rate during the war, and their population was severely diminished." As we start to transition away from the American Revolution and toward the Civil War in our research and presentation, we shared 2 images from the St. Mark's Church Register, 2 type pages held in the Episcopal Church of Connecticut archives. The archives recently retrieved all Connecticut Episcopal Church records from the Connecticut Historical Society, but there was not much. St. Mark's Church Registry dates to 1839, but recounts earlier years. This first image is a retyped transcription of a 1791 entry when Canaan Parish members were trying to come to terms with the loyalist clergy of Stamford and Norwalk as they sought to redefine themselves away from the Church of England post-Revolutionary War. Brian, would you read that first section, please?
It being the universal wish of the members of this church to continue their connection with their brethren in the old societies in the towns of Stamford and Norwalk with the Reverend Mr. Dibble and the Reverend Mr. Ogilvie. They are determined to cultivate harmony and good agreement as far as in them lays, and to remove, if possible, every obstacle to the contrary. And notwithstanding, we have separated and fixed ourselves upon the firm basis of an ecclesiastical society founded upon several statutes of this state. Yet we by no means wish to dispense with the performance of the Reverend Mr. Dibble and the Reverend Mr. Ogilvie, but pray these gentlemen to consider our spiritual wants. And in case they decline, and then we stop there. At a special meeting, it was voted that Stephen Betts serve as lay delegate to the convention at Norwalk this instant, June the 8th. This may certify that Ebenezer Hanford II has left the Episcopal Society of Canaan and joined the North Baptist Society of Stamford and means to support the gospel in that society.
Thank you, Brian. That second part was showing more kind of sorting and shifting going on as the years progressed away from the American Revolution. Stephen Betts was a lay delegate in 1798 in our parish, now called the Episcopal Society of Canaan. The new name is used as of 1791 in church records. One, as Brian mentioned, one parishioner, Ebenezer Hanford, left to join another denomination, the North Baptist Society in Stamford. So other denominations were entering the area. And now I'd like to introduce Brian again, who will speak about the Underground Railroad in Connecticut. Brian?
Thank you. The Underground Railroad was a network of brave people, mostly African Americans and Quaker abolitionists, offering shelter and aid to escaped enslaved people as they tried to make it to freedom in the north of the United States and Canada. Now, this is a mid-19th century map of official slave states in red and states where slavery was abolished in blue. And as you see up here, although slavery was known in Connecticut, by the time of this map, it had ended. The great debate over the fate of slaves was finally resolved by the Civil War. Connecticut had a very strong abolitionist party, mainly Congregationalists and Quakers. William Lloyd Garrison and others formed the Anti-Slavery Society in 1833, but it wasn't until 1848 that slavery actually ended in Connecticut. As the home of Frederick Douglass, an author and escaped slave, he was a frequent speaker at meetings at towns all over the state. Slaves were kept in ignorance and poverty, working long hours and always under the threat of physical punishment or being sold down the river to plantations in Mississippi, Louisiana, and the Caribbean. And of course, it's not surprising that many slaves tried to escape their bondage. Keep in mind, though, they were trying to evade tracker dogs, bounty hunters, slavery sympathizers, and others who would betray them for a variety of reasons. Add on to these challenges their ignorance of the territory they were escaping to, and you see the bravery or desperation needed to attempt escape. Escaped slaves traveled north on foot or by sea, arriving in our area via New York or Rhode Island or Connecticut ports. Now, this map shows Underground Railroad sites in Connecticut. The nearest to us in New Canaan are Stamford, Darien, and Wilton. These were sanctuaries as they moved up the coast before heading north towards Hartford and the Massachusetts border. Here are some known agents in our area. Benjamin Dascom in Stamford, William Wakeman in Wilton, and a fellow by the name of Weed over here in Darien. Now, you should note, though, that Dascom and Weed are well-known local names today. In addition, Silas Mead, a deacon in the North Greenwich Congregational Church, was a prominent abolitionist and contact for fugitive slaves. Bringing things up to date, this is a recent photo of an existing home, which was part of the network. And on the right-hand side there, the current resident is shown next to a trapdoor leading into a hiding place for slaves in the basement. Other locations had barns or outbuildings the slaves could stop in overnight. And we should keep in mind that bounty hunters were active in Connecticut, and escaped slaves were not well protected from them by law or custom. And this is the gravestone of Onesimus Comstock over here in the Canoe Hill cemetery. And while there is lore that Onesimus Comstock assisted in some way with the Underground Railroad, no documentation was found to support this claim. And you'll note also the little American flag there. He was also, help me out on this one, Lisa, he was listed somewhat as a member of the Revolutionary War Army.
So we will, so we could not find verification of that, unfortunately. Yeah. But thank you so much, Brian. Appreciate this. And now we're going to head into free men and women of color in New Canaan. The slavery was abolished in Connecticut in 1848. Once freed, a free man of color or woman of color had a tremendous struggle on their hands. They still had to put a roof over their head and food on the table, which is why some decided to remain with their slave owner, like Jesse Betts or Onesimus Comstock did. Onesimus called himself a voluntary slave in the 1850 census. Remember that most enslaved people did not know how to read or write. There had been laws enacted to guard against slave literacy. If they had a viable skill, like being a blacksmith, they could perhaps set up a business of their own, but racism and the cheating of them was rampant, as Venture Smith pointed out. Many ended up in their town's poorhouse. There's a mention by Joanne Rice, Find a Grave local researcher from some years ago, that New Canaan's poorhouse on Laurel Road had housed free people of color. We were unable to find the source for that information, but it is likely true. The poorhouse's main house, pictured here in the late 1800s or early 1900s, was built in 1776. The town owned it as a poorhouse from 1852 to 1923 when residents were moved out. The poorhouse was meant to be self-sustaining, and over time, a chicken coop, pig house, milk house, ice house, smokehouse, and 2 barns were added. After the town sold it in 1925, it became known as X-Town Farm and has been a private residence ever since. The Civil War in Connecticut. Connecticut had important abolitionists, including John Brown, Harriet Beecher Stowe, who was the author of Uncle Tom's Cabin, and Prudence Crandall, who started a school for Black girls. The state also was where the Africans who were enslaved on the Armistead and took it over from their captors were eventually freed after a trial. Abraham Lincoln won a solid majority of votes in Connecticut in the 1860 election. Matthew Warshauer is the author of the book Connecticut in the American Civil War, Slavery, Sacrifice, and Survival, published in 2011. The abolitionist William Lloyd Garrison once called Connecticut, and these are Matthew's words, once called Connecticut the Georgia of New England for its hostile attitudes toward people of color. Connecticut Democrats believed the South had a right to secede and that it was wrong to abolish slavery. They did well at Connecticut polls, and the state soundly rejected proposals to grant voting rights to Black men, not women of any race, but Black men, before and after the Civil War. The simple truth is that in the land of steady habits, one of the steadiest was a virulent racism, Warshauer writes. One Republican campaigning in Connecticut during the election of 1860 took a moderate stance that distanced him from abolitionists, even while he favored stopping the expansion of slavery. He likened it to a cyst that doctors couldn't remove surgically because it might kill the patient. Instead, he advocated containing slavery, making a compromise as our fathers did, giving the slaveholder the entire control where the systems was established, while we possess the power to restrain it from going outside those limits. That Republican was Abraham Lincoln. Few of Connecticut's 55,000 men who marched off to the Civil War did so with the goal of Black freedom, Warshauer writes. Nearly half of Connecticut's population was steadfastly opposed to fighting the South. The great motivating factor for many, perhaps most, who marched off to war was patriotism. or nationalism. The idea that this American Union of States, one of the world's only democracies at the time, needed to be preserved. An enormous portion of Connecticut men of military age went off to war. A total of 47% of men between the ages of 15 and 50 went into Union uniform. And while many from especially Fairfield County had been loyalists during the American Revolution, there were very few who chose to align with the Confederate cause. Among Connecticut's 8,627 Black residents at the time, 78% of Black males between the ages of 15 and 50 entered military service. And the state formed 2 regiments of color in the Union Army, the 29th and the 30th Regiments, United States Colored Infantry. The 30th would eventually become the 31st. Connecticut's white soldiers were spread throughout the conflict, so that some were present in every major conflict, military conflict of the Civil War. Of the 55,684 Connecticut men who went off to war, 5,354, or almost 10%, were killed. And prejudice blocked Black enlistment until the Civil War's 3rd year. In January of 1863, President Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation that freed slaves in the border states and authorized enslavement of Black soldiers. In May, the United States Department of War issued orders that established the Bureau of Colored Troops. But Connecticut did not move as quickly as other New England states, such as Massachusetts and Rhode Island. On November 13th, at a special session of the Connecticut General Assembly, was proposed a bill authorizing Governor William A. Buckingham to organize regiments of colored infantry. That's what they call it, colored infantry. Connecticut Democrats denounced the bill, arguing it would let loose upon the helpless South, in quotes, a horde of African barbarians. They predicted Black cowardice, disgrace, and ruin as a result of the experiment, end of quotes. Governor Buckingham authorized the bill anyway, calling for volunteers to make up the 29th Regiment Colored Volunteers. And despite the fact that many Black laborers earned wages that were higher than the Army pay plus enlistment bounty, the response was immediate and enthusiastic. By January 1864, more than 1,200 men of color voluntarily signed up for the 29th Regiment, and more than 400 additional ones joined a separate colored regiment, the 30th. These were the 29th and 30th Regiments, United States Colored Infantry. The regiments were encamped in Fairhaven, near New Haven, and by the end of January, the regiment's officers, all of them white, were chosen. Daily drills and rigid inspections took place. On January 29th, 1864, the soldiers were addressed by the famed Black abolitionist Frederick Douglass. And Dick, would you read that on the right?
As was said on January 29th, 1864, you are pioneers of liberty of your race, with the United States cap on your head, the United States eagle on your belt, the United States musket on your shoulder. Not all the powers of darkness can prevent you from becoming American citizens. A very powerful statement.
Very powerful. Thank you. Men were offered an enlistment bounty of $600 and the same pay and uniforms as the white soldiers. Where they were stationed. There were a total of 175 regiments of color in the Civil War. The 29th Regiment was transported to Beaufort, South Carolina, where it performed guard and picket duty for 4 months. In August, they were brought to the siege lines of Virginia. The 30th served on guard duty in Virginia during the first half of June, then entered the Petersburg trenches and participated in the infamous Crater attack on July 30th, when the Union military attempted to dig and explode a tunnel directly under the Confederate lines. The 29th and 30th Regiments along with the rest of the Army of the Potomac, moved around the city of Richmond, Virginia, fighting in multiple battles from Bermuda Hundred to the Battle of Fair Oaks before April 1865, when Petersburg surrendered. When the Confederate capital, Richmond, fell to Union forces in early April 1865, Black soldiers from the C and G companies of the 29th Regiment were among the first to enter the city. S.C. Gwynn, in his book, Hymns of the Republic, from 2019, does not mention members of the 29th Regiment as being one of the very first to enter Richmond, but he does give this account. Addie?
The first Union infantrymen to enter the city of Richmond were Black. Many were former slaves. This epic victory for African Americans was a superb irony and happened in spite of the great efforts by white soldiers to prevent it. They wanted to be the first in. The regiments of color were four winners of the Medal of Honor. They were a surprisingly diverse group who had fought hard and well and suffered a higher casualty count to prove it. One of the war's great scenes unfolded as the Black soldiers cheered and cried and danced and hugged each other at their great good fortune. Meanwhile, Richmond's former slaves and freedmen gathered around them, awestruck by the splendidly equipped army and astonished that the soldiers were Black. They cheered and hurrahed and waved hats in the air and cried, "You've come at last, and Jesus has opened the way." The regiments of color were ordered to stand aside, as it was 3 miles until the center of Richmond was reached. White soldiers would take the lead, but the Black soldiers were having none of that. They double timed through the cornfields to the center of town, and it was 10 to 15 minutes until a single white regiment came into sight. An African-American reporter, J.M. Chester, was there to report it, as he was afraid that the white press would give credit only to white soldiers, and that is why this account exists. From the Gwynn book, quote, "The following day, President Lincoln arrived. The riverboat, River Queen, had to dodge mines and sunken vessels on the way upstream. He arrived to cries of 'hang him' until the people realized which president had arrived. Lincoln had not gotten far when the city's Black population streamed forth from their humble homes and tar paper shacks. They wept and cried for joy, reached to touch his hand, but mainly they spoke to him as the man who had set them free. Glory to God, glory, glory, glory," repeated one man, "come to free his children from bondage." In September 2008, a monument dedicated to the 29th Regiment Colored Volunteers was dedicated in New Haven. It is the first monument in the state to honor Black soldiers.
Thank you, Addie. I want to go back a couple slides to this one. And we, in the Civil War, we start to see some photography, which is very helpful. So I'm looking at the top photo there that shows the destruction that took place. And I want to describe what happened more fully to you. And it is thoroughly described in the S.C. Gwynn book, Hymns of the Republic, which was a finalist for the 2019 Pulitzer Prize. The night before the Union Army arrived in Richmond, Jefferson Davis gave orders to the few Confederate soldiers that remained in Richmond. He ordered that many things be burned, including the cotton, tobacco, and foodstuffs. A scorched earth policy, after which Davis and his cabinet ministers left town on 8:30 p.m. train, held until 11 p.m., waiting on possible turnaround news from General Robert E. Lee that never came. They left on Sunday night, April 2nd, 1865. They didn't want to leave anything behind that would advantage the Union Army. Confederate soldiers began burning stores, churches, and blowing up arsenals. And some of this made sense, but some things like the burning of mountains of Confederate currency made no sense since it was already valueless. They also burned locomotives and boats, which hindered residents who wished to escape town. The goal for residents was to use a boat, like the one above there. Those are people who are escaping town in their personal, boat, and paddling down the James River. Others exited via the few remaining trains. The soldiers didn't tell the townspeople the plan, so they blew up an arsenal in a neighborhood, blew up the entire neighborhood in the process, including the poorhouse and its residents. The soldiers had also been ordered to destroy all remaining liquor in Richmond. And I want to just click down to this. That bottom photo shows a broader view of the overall destruction. You can see it's basically stone and brick that remains. So again, the soldiers had also been ordered to destroy all remaining liquor in Richmond. What was left as Richmond burned was cask upon cask of whiskey. In the general lawlessness, these casks were open and whiskey flowed through the streets and gutters, inches deep. Everyone started drinking the whiskey, licking it out of the streets or using spoons until they were all completely drunk, and then the looting began. The citizens thought that the Union Army, upon its arrival, would loot, maim, and commit atrocities. And this was understandable based on Sherman's march to the sea through Georgia in November and December of 1864, which was intended to scare Southerners into giving up their cause. What happened instead was the complete opposite. The Union soldiers were polite, humble, respectful, and orderly. Plus, be they black or white, arrived looking like $1 million, fully outfitted in uniform. By the second night of being there, local Richmond residents were asking Union soldiers to guard their residences against looters. The Confederate Army, in contrast, had been starving for months. A day's rations was a piece of bacon fat and a cracker. A typical Union soldier was eating 6 times the amount of food in a day as his Confederate counterpart. And about half of the Confederate soldiers had no shoes. They had no shoes. Plus, their mail was being held from them or censored. Their family members back home were starving and their homes were riddled with disease. So the soldiers would read these letters from home asking them to please come home, and they would disappear in the night. The overall concept for Southern slavery had been that a slave was better off being held in bondage than to try to make it as freed without resources of food, employment, or shelter. In the last year of the war, 1865, with considerable attrition in the ranks, there was a movement to recruit slaves into the Confederate Army. Now, that's a really tough sell when you've been saying for decades that these individuals are subhuman, and now you want to arm them and ask for their assistance in an act that would keep them enslaved. Most slave owners whose cooperation was necessary hated the idea. Jefferson Davis went ahead with the plan, essentially freedom in exchange for service. There were a few Confederate regiments of color formed, but it was too little too late. From the Gwynn book, in quotes, even if few Southerners admitted it, a moral threshold had been crossed. Slavery as an institution was as good as gone. And as one Confederate soldier stated, slavery has received its death blow. So I want to mention Thomas Morris Chester, or T.M. Chester. The reporter T.M. Chester came to Richmond to cover the fall of the Confederacy. He was the son of a slave who had been willed his freedom. So Chester was raised as a free Black man, a college-educated, extremely literate Black man. As he sat at the speaker's desk in the Confederate House of Representatives the night before the Union's arrival, he wrote a dispatch. A paroled Confederate officer came up, flew into a rage, and demanded that he leave. T.M. Chester calmly kept writing his report. The officer came at him again, upon which Chester decked the guy with a single punch. He realized that if he had done the same exact thing one night earlier, he would have been hung. Thomas Morris Chester went on to become a barrister in London. I highly recommend that you research this individual further. T.M. Chester or Thomas Morris Chester. So now I'm going to click through to Benjamin Belden Smith. So there's a record of the enslaved and then free man of color, Benjamin Smith, having a Civil War marker near his grave in the Canoe Hill Cemetery. As you may recall, Benjamin Belden Smith was married to Grace Richards, and their slave owner had been Diana Richards. Once freed, Benjamin and Grace owned a cabin on Poorhouse Road, Laurel Road, and they attended church every Sunday at St. Mark's Church near God's Acre. There is a record in the U.S. military archives of a Benjamin Smith being a private in the 30th Regiment, but we cannot be certain that this is New Canaan's Benjamin Smith, who would have been 65 years old in 1865. The age range of soldiers being recruited seemed to end at age 50. New Canaan's Civil War soldiers. 91 New Canaan men enlisted in the 17th Connecticut Regiment Volunteers. These would have been white soldiers, as regiments were segregated in the Civil War. Of the 91, 80 New Canaan men served in Company H. They were known as New Canaan's Company. They fought at Chancellorsville, Virginia, and ended the war in Jacksonville, Florida. So we end this session with a mention of the cotton gin and arms manufacturing from Connecticut. In 1794, Eli Whitney in Connecticut received a patent for the cotton gin, a machine that revolutionized cotton production. It optimized the labor-intensive task of cleaning seeds from raw cotton bolls, B-O-L-L-S, bolls. Whitney patented the invention, but it was often and easily pirated in the South. Whitney headed south to stop, but couldn't stop, the flagrant violation of his patent, and then returned to Connecticut in 1804, where he turned his focus to transforming arms manufacturing. He met with commercial and financial success. He invented a system of making rifles with interchangeable parts at his workshop in Hamden that proved instrumental in the rise of New England as an industrial power and Connecticut as an arms manufacturer. While Whitney made rifles, cotton cultivation, thanks to the pirated cotton gin, continued to spread through southern states like wildfire. Demand for new lands on which to grow cotton became insatiable, and cotton production doubled every 10 years. With it came a sharp increase in demand for enslaved labor and an expansion of the country's dehumanizing slave trade. Tragically, the invention Whitney thought would end slavery triggered the expansion of that, as he called it, peculiar institution to such an extent that within 6 decades, it would help lead the United States into civil war. From worddetective.com, as of 1887, the expression to gin meant to work hard or make things hum, like a cotton gin in operation. The influence of both inventions, born in Connecticut by Eli Whitney, cannot be overstated. Eli Whitney left, Eli Whitney is shown on the left, and on the right is an illustration of an enslaved Southern men using a cotton gin from an 1869 issue of Harper's Weekly magazine. So this concludes our presentation of Era 1. Please join us in the fall for Eras 2 and 3. Era 2 is the pre-World War I to post-World War II. And Era 3 is post-World War II through the Civil Rights Movement. So I'll end with this. If you are in need of a little hope at this moment, I highly recommend that you go to this website, which is entitled Today in Connecticut History. It's the Office of the State Historian and Connecticut Humanities. And look for this article from September 12th of last fall, 2020. Entitled Martin Luther King Jr.'s Teenage Summer in Simsbury. When Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. came to Simsbury, Connecticut as a teenager, he encountered a freedom he had never experienced before. Freedom to dine where he wished and to sit in a movie theater in a non-segregated fashion. His experience in Connecticut helped to form his profound vision in adulthood. And now we will head to the Q&A.
Lisa, thank you so much. I wonder if we might all share a Zoom round of applause for our team here. Just really, really fabulous work. an immense amount of work, and it's been so much to fit into this final presentation, which took us all the way to the Civil War. So I know that we're right here at the end of our time, but I hope that we can take at least one question or a comment. I did want for everybody to see the link to Sarah Borsi's fantastic presentation on Frederick Douglass, who got a cameo here. Sarah is our resident Frederick Douglass expert, and her presentation was beautiful. So I wanted to let people know that Stan Torty shared with me the 1989 movie Glory about the role of Black soldiers from Massachusetts in the Civil War, which becomes highly recommended from Stan if you're interested more in learning about our Black regiments from New England and the role that they played in the Civil War. My power is flickering a little bit here, so if I disappear, just proceed without me. But anybody with a question or a comment, please raise your Zoom hand. Sarah, would you like to speak to your question if I unmute you?
Yeah, I was just curious if there were military chaplains, you know, when did that start becoming a thing? And if there were military chaplains, were they, you know, were they ministering to Black soldiers that were serving the country?
I know that by World War II, units had chaplains. That's a really good question as to when they started ministering to their units. You know, the further we got toward, you know, Vietnam, you would see chaplains of many different faiths. And in fact, you know, they would, sometimes you'd have someone who, they would use this starting line for their prayers. They'd say, I invite you to pray in your faith and tradition as I pray in mine. Let us pray together, because they were trying to unite all these individuals of varying faiths. But that was, you know, 1900s on. So I don't know exactly the answer to your question. I think it's a terrific one. I'd love to know more.
Perhaps we have time for one more question as the bell is tolled here. Zuhair, go for it.
I'm just away by this program, and I see that we have 30 some people on it, which is good, but this thing should turn, with all the work, the excellent work you guys have done, into a book, or it should be a series on PBS, so hundreds of thousands of people get to see it.
I agree.
So I'll speak up here. Lisa and I have had conversation about this. Zuhair, thank you so much for saying so, Zuhair. I couldn't agree more. So all of these talks are recorded and available on our website. Lisa and the team are going to be engaged in turning the incredible manuscript of these talks into a book format to be preserved in the St. Mark's Library, and I hope also available for dissemination, so that anybody who would like to have one may. Anything to add to that, Lisa?
No, actually, I'm so sorry. I have to go off to another presentation now.
Brilliant.
So I don't mean to be rude. I have to head out because it started a minute ago. So it's been so great being with all of you over these sessions. I appreciate your attention and your fantastic questions. And I applaud the team. I've so enjoyed working with all of you, and I look forward to working with you again in the fall for ears 2 and 3. And Father Justin, you just rock. I so enjoy working with you. And I told him I'm coming on Sunday in person, even though I really like watching it on the screen. And I'll just have to take off my UGG slippers and just come in person to honor him and his PhD. So with that, I have to head out. I'm so sorry. I don't mean to be rude. I've got to go. Bye.
Oh, Lisa, you're the best. You are the best of the best. Unbelievable, Lisa. Shockingly unbelievable. And Justin is the best. And you are unbelievable, unbelievable, unbelievable. Nobody could guess the hours and care you put into this. It's unbelievable, off the chart.
Thanks so much. Thank you. Take care.
Yeah.
And here in our final moment, now that the maestro has left the stage, Father Peter, would you pray us away here?
I will. I just want to give thanks for the spiritual movement that has brought this to us, the arc of the life of our community. We are people on the seas of grace, and I'm so grateful to all of you who have led that and ridden ridden the board here that we can all get on. I mean, the work that Lisa has done is just immeasurable. And Dick and Brian, we're ever so grateful to you for your hearts for the history of our people, and for the honesty and dogged research that you have been all about. And we're grateful to Addie, who bore witness to the importance of their work earlier today, not so much in word, but in quaking of voice, that really it brings the fullness of what we're all about here. It's not just, this isn't history of the head, this is history of the heart and history of the soul too. And it's true, Lisa, his comment about you, Justin, is absolutely true. Scott, I'm so glad you're on the screen to hear this, Scott. When I was speaking with you and Lisa at your house, and Lisa said something about Father Justin, my boss, which made me laugh out loud. You guys have been a fantastic working team together. And I know that the people were awestruck and astonished when the Black Regiment came into Richmond, but I would say everybody on the screen is awestruck and astonished by the work that you've all done. We're all going to take a big deep breath here as summertime is coming, and the researchers need a break. They've been working hard and they need a little break, and they're going to reboot in the fall and beyond. But we give thanks for the work you guys have done, and we give thanks for the Sabbath that is also coming. I'd like to finish us with a final prayer, but I do that. I pray for all. This prayer comes from the Book of Common Prayer, and it comes from all of us. But I want to finally say, I'm grateful to everybody who not only did the work, but who gave their time. I hope you'll take a moment at some point and look at the screen and see the names of your brothers and sisters in Christ who are joining in with this labor. There are many, many more who do join and see this on the YouTube version, and others who hear about the work. But please put those names in your heart, for you're all moved by the same Spirit. So in thanksgiving for each and every one of you, let us pray. Oh God, you made us in your image, and you redeemed us through your Son, Jesus. Look with compassion on the whole human family. Take away the arrogance and hatred which infect our hearts. Break down the walls that separate us. Unite us in bonds of love, and work through our struggle and confusion to accomplish your purposes on earth, that in your good time all nations and races may serve you in harmony around your heavenly throne, through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen. And may the Vesper blessings of God rest upon you, rest upon our church, and rest upon our world on this Tuesday evening as we move forward with God of grace and God of glory.